Marcus Carter had always been a man of discipline. He believed in the power of patience, in the quiet strength of endurance, and in the ability to remain calm in situations that would make others explode with frustration. It was late at night, a little past 11, when he was driving home from a long meeting at the city office. His tie was loosened, his suit jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat, and the gentle hum of the radio filled the quiet air around him. The road was nearly empty, only a few cars passing every now and then, their headlights sweeping across the dark streets. Marcus liked these hours. They were peaceful, allowing him a moment to breathe after long days filled with decisions, paperwork, and endless conversations about change. As he approached an intersection, he noticed the faint glow of headlights behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. But then the glow grew brighter, and in a split second, flashing red and blue lights painted the inside of his car. His heart sank, though not from guilt. He had done nothing wrong. He was within the speed limit, his registration was up to date, and his record was clean. But Marcus knew too well what those lights could mean for a man who looked like him. He pulled over slowly, signaled with care, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The night air felt heavier now. The police car stopped behind him and 3 officers stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement with authority. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding him as they approached. Marcus remained still, his breathing steady, though his chest tightened with the kind of tension he had felt many times before. The lead officer tapped on his window with the edge of his flashlight. "Step out of the car," the officer barked, without asking for a license, without explanation. Marcus rolled down the window halfway, his voice calm. "Officer, may I ask the reason for the stop?" "Step out," the officer repeated, sharper this time. His tone was not the tone of someone enforcing the law with fairness. It was the tone of someone asserting dominance. Marcus understood this language well. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible, and stepped out into the cold night air. The second officer circled around the car, shining his light inside as though Marcus were a suspect in a major crime. "Whose car is this?" he asked with suspicion. "It's mine," Marcus replied evenly. The officer smirked. "Really? You expect us to believe that?" The words were sharp, meant to cut. Marcus looked at them, his expression still calm but his heart heavy. He had worked his whole life to stand tall in moments like this. He had known since he was young that there would be times when he would not be seen for who he was, but only for what they assumed him to be. The third officer joined in, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "You fit the description," he muttered, though he never clarified what description that was. Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly. "Description of what?" His voice was respectful but firm. He was not about to play into their attempt to provoke him. Yet he knew very well that his calmness was the only shield he had at this moment. The lead officer ordered him to place his hands on the hood of the car. Marcus obeyed, not because he believed he deserved this treatment, but because he understood the danger of resistance in moments like these. The cold metal stung his palms as the officer patted him down, searching for something that was never there. Meanwhile, the second officer rummaged through his car without permission, pulling out his laptop bag and opening it carelessly. "Expensive computer you got here," the officer sneered. "Doesn't look like it belongs to you." Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying his breath. He wanted to speak, to demand respect, but he also knew that every word could be twisted, every protest could be treated as aggression. So he chose silence, the kind of silence that was not weakness but strength. Inside, though, he felt the sting of humiliation, not for himself, but for the countless others who had endured nights like this and had no voice to defend them. The flashlight beam moved across his suit jacket, his polished shoes, the neatness of his car. Instead of seeing a man who had built his life on hard work, they saw only suspicion. Instead of recognizing dignity, they saw only a threat. The irony was painful, but Marcus refused to let it break him. "Where are you coming from?" one officer demanded. "From work," Marcus answered simply. "And where exactly do you work?" The lead officer pressed, his voice thick with disbelief. Marcus looked at him steadily. "At the city office," the officer laughed, a mocking sound. "Sure you do. And I'm the mayor." The others chuckled with him as if the idea that Marcus could hold an important job was beyond imagination. Marcus did not react. He had learned a long time ago that dignity was not in how others saw you, but in how you carried yourself when they refused to see you clearly. The search continued. Papers were scattered. The glove compartment was left open, and Marcus stood by silently, his hands still visible, his back straight. Every minute dragged like an hour. He thought of his family, of his parents who had taught him never to let anger define him, of his younger self who had promised that one day he would make a difference in the very system that tried to break him. Tonight he felt the weight of that promise heavier than ever. The night grew quieter. The only sounds were the rustle of papers, the heavy boots on asphalt, and the occasional mocking remark. Neighbors peeked from their windows, their eyes catching glimpses of a man in a suit treated like a criminal. Marcus knew the shame was not his to carry, but theirs for witnessing the truth of a world still chained to prejudice. And yet, in that very moment of humiliation, Marcus also knew something else. He knew that what they saw was not the end of his story. What they saw was only the surface, the mask of assumption. Behind it, hidden from their narrow vision, was a truth they could not yet comprehend. He was not just a man driving home. He was the man who held in his hands the power to change the course of their careers, and perhaps even the culture of the very department they represented. For now, though, Marcus endured the stop with the same quiet strength he had carried all his life. He stood under the weight of their suspicion, not knowing that soon, very soon, the balance of power would shift. And when it did, the lesson would not be his to learn. It would be theirs. The search dragged on longer than Marcus expected, and with every passing minute the night felt colder, heavier, almost suffocating. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in restless colors, reflecting off windows, off the glossy hood of his car, and even off the sharp edges of the officers' badges. But despite the noise and motion around him, Marcus stood still, steady in both posture and mind. He had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power, though in moments like this it was a power often mistaken for weakness. The officers moved like hunters circling prey. One continued to shuffle through Marcus's laptop bag, shaking his head as if each professional folder and neatly stacked document was evidence of a crime. Another officer leaned against the car with a smirk plastered on his face, arms folded as if he were certain that the man before him could not possibly be who he said he was. The lead officer paced back and forth, his flashlight darting across Marcus's face, shoes, and clothes as if trying to find something out of place, some small detail that would justify the suspicion that had guided their stop. Marcus's silence seemed to frustrate them. They wanted him flustered. They wanted him to stumble over words, to grow angry, to give them a reason to write the story they had already decided upon before they pulled him over. But instead, Marcus's voice, when it finally came, was calm and deliberate. "Officer," he said slowly, "I would like to know the reason you stopped me tonight." The lead officer's laugh was short and sharp. "Reason? You want a reason? How about the fact that you're driving a car that doesn't belong to you? How about the fact that you're dressed in a way that doesn't fit this neighborhood? How about the fact that you fit the description of someone we're looking for?" It was a familiar list. Marcus had heard variations of it before, back when he was a young man and stopped for walking home from school, and again when he was in college driving back to campus. The words changed, but the meaning never did. The assumption was always the same. You do not belong here, you cannot possibly be who you appear to be, and we must reduce you to the label that already exists in our minds. Marcus held his gaze. "With respect," he said evenly, "this car is mine and I work in this city. I have nothing to hide." The second officer, the one searching his bag, pulled out Marcus's identification folder. He flipped through the papers carelessly, shaking his head again. "All this looks fake," he said loudly, as though trying to convince himself. "You expect us to believe you've got a job at the city office?" "That's a joke." Another chuckle escaped the group. Marcus's heart tightened. He wanted to shout, to tell them that not only was his position real, but it was earned through decades of sacrifice and work. He wanted to tell them about the nights he had studied until his eyes could no longer stay open, about the community that believed in him when the system did not, about the countless hours he had poured into the kind of service that went unnoticed by men like these. But he held his tongue because he knew that truth spoken in anger would be twisted into something else. The mockery continued. "Look at the shoes," one officer said with a grin. "Probably bought them with someone else's credit card." "Look at the suit," the other added. "Bet he borrowed it for the night." The laughter that followed was not only cruel, it was casual. the kind of laughter that revealed how comfortable they were in their prejudice. It was not the first time they had spoken this way. It would not be the last. To them, Marcus was not a man, not a citizen, not even a human being with a story of his own. He was just a target, a mirror reflecting their assumptions back at them. And yet Marcus remained composed. He breathed slowly, reminding himself that storms pass. He thought of his parents again, especially his father, who used to tell him when he was a boy, "Never let them decide who you are, Marcus. Let your life speak for itself. Let your work, your patience, and your character be the answer they cannot argue with." Tonight, those words echoed in his mind more than ever. The neighborhood around them had grown quieter. Curtains had shifted, blinds had been lowered, and the faint outlines of faces peered from behind glass. The neighbors were watching, but no one came outside. Marcus understood. Fear kept people behind walls, and disbelief kept them from interfering. Perhaps they thought he had done something wrong. Perhaps they assumed the officers knew best. Or perhaps deep down they recognized what was happening but felt powerless to change it. The lead officer finally stepped closer, standing only a foot away from Marcus, the flashlight beam steady on his face. His voice lowered, sharp with menace. "You better start telling the truth or we'll take you downtown tonight." "You want that?" Marcus stared back, his voice still calm though heavy with meaning. "I am telling you the truth. Everything you see here is mine. I have done nothing wrong." For a long moment there was silence. The tension hung like a blade in the air. The officer searched Marcus's eyes, perhaps looking for fear, for guilt, for some reaction to hold on to. But Marcus's stillness offered none of those things. Instead, it reflected something the officer was not prepared for: dignity. That dignity was the quiet refusal to break under the weight of their assumptions. It was the strength to carry years of injustice without letting bitterness define him. It was the power of knowing who he was, even when others tried to strip that identity away. And in that silence, Marcus held on to the one truth that mattered most: that his worth was not defined by their prejudice, but by the life he had built, the work he had done, and the respect he had earned. The search continued, though it was clear they would find nothing. But the officers were not searching for evidence. They were searching for validation of the story they had already written. Each empty compartment, each clean record only deepened their frustration. Minutes stretched into an hour, the humiliation dragging on like a punishment without reason. And all the while Marcus endured, not because he had to, but because he knew that endurance was often the only weapon left to those who sought justice in a world too slow to grant it. What Marcus did not know, what none of the officers knew, was that this night, heavy with suspicion and prejudice, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lesson far greater than any of them could imagine. Because the man they mocked, the man they reduced with laughter and doubt, was the very man who would soon stand as their superior, the man who carried the authority to hold them accountable. But that revelation had not yet arrived. For now, Marcus stood in the glow of flashing lights, bearing the weight of prejudice on full display, and though the night was long and cold, he carried himself with the quiet certainty that truth, in time, has a way of revealing itself. The night seemed endless for Marcus as he remained pressed against the cold metal of his own car. His palms lay flat on the hood, fingers splayed, the surface vibrating faintly from the idle hum of the engine. The officers had stopped asking questions, but their behavior had grown sharper, colder, as though silence itself gave them license to treat him like less of a man and more of an object to control. The humiliation came not just from their words, but from the way they moved, the way they ignored the humanity in front of them and chose instead to see only suspicion. The second officer tossed Marcus's papers back onto the passenger seat as though they were scraps of trash. His laptop bag, once neatly packed, lay open on the ground, its contents spilling across the pavement. Important documents, carefully organized for tomorrow's meeting, fluttered slightly in the breeze. Marcus noticed how little care was given to them, how casually years of his professional work could be dismissed with the flick of a hand. It was not about the documents, of course. It was about stripping away his dignity. One officer leaned close to him, so close that Marcus could smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath. "You think you're smart, don't you?" the officer whispered harshly. "Men like you always think they're smarter than us. But out here, you're not in charge. We are." The words carried no real authority, only intimidation. But Marcus felt their sting all the same. He knew that to argue, to push back, would only escalate the situation. So he remained silent. His silence was not agreement, nor was it fear. It was survival. Yet survival came with its own form of pain. The pain of swallowing truth when it deserved to be spoken. The pain of knowing that neighbors were watching from their windows, some likely believing that he must have done something wrong to deserve this. A small group of onlookers had gathered at the end of the street now, their faces dimly lit by the flashing lights. A mother pulled her child close, whispering something as she turned him away from the scene. A young man held his phone in his hand but did not raise it to record, perhaps afraid of drawing attention to himself. And then there were others who simply stared, their expressions unreadable, choosing observation over intervention. Marcus felt the heat of their gazes and knew that in their minds, this image would remain long after the night was over. A black man in a suit treated like a criminal. The lead officer called for backup over his radio, though there was no reason for it. Another squad car arrived within minutes, and with it came more officers. Marcus counted 6 now, all standing around him, all projecting the same energy of suspicion. One laughed quietly as he pointed to Marcus's shoes. "Look at those. Shiny like he just came from a wedding. Who's he trying to impress?" The laughter spread again, and though it seemed casual, it was meant to cut him down, to remind him of the imbalance of power in this moment. They wanted him to feel small. They wanted him to feel powerless. What they did not realize was that humiliation, while sharp, does not always destroy. It can also forge resilience. Marcus had carried humiliation before, and each time it had hardened his resolve, reminding him why he worked so hard, why he aimed to change the very system that now pressed him down. One officer tapped the side of his head as though mocking his calm demeanor. "Not talking much, huh? That's what guilty men do. Stay quiet, hope we let them go." Marcus finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "I'm quiet because nothing I say will matter to you right now. You've already decided who I am without knowing me." The words caught the officer off guard. For a moment his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of discomfort. But pride quickly returned and he scoffed, muttering under his breath, "We'll see about that." The search dragged into absurdity. They looked beneath the seats, checked the trunk, even tapped the tires as though expecting them to reveal something. Each empty discovery only heightened their frustration, but rather than step back, they doubled down, searching harder, digging deeper into nothing. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, not out of fear but from the weight of enduring an hour of being treated like less than human. As the officers circled, Marcus's thoughts drifted inward. He remembered being a young boy sitting on the porch with his grandfather, who had once told him, "The hardest thing in this world is to know the truth of who you are when others refuse to see it. But if you hold steady, if you carry that truth long enough, it will outlast their blindness." Marcus had carried that advice through school, through college, through his career, and tonight, standing in the cold glow of police flashlights, he clung to it again. The humiliation continued when one officer ordered Marcus to spread his feet wider and pressed him against the car with unnecessary force. The impact rattled his bones, but he did not resist. Another officer yanked his wallet from his pocket without permission, flipping through it as though expecting counterfeit bills to spill out. When he found Marcus's ID, he examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, shaking his head. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, even though it was a perfectly valid identification. It was a game of control, a performance meant to reinforce dominance. Marcus knew it well. He had studied it not just as a man who lived through it, but also as a man who had spent years working inside the very structures that allowed it to happen. And though tonight was deeply personal, he also understood that it was not only about him. It was about every individual who had stood in his place, every life interrupted by prejudice, every quiet act of survival forced by injustice. Finally, the lead officer leaned back, his expression one of disappointment masked by arrogance. "Nothing here," he said flatly. But then he added, "Yet." The word carried a cruel weight, as if suggesting that guilt was inevitable even without evidence. Marcus lifted his head slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. "The truth doesn't change no matter how hard you look for something else." The officer glared but said nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, their laughter gone now, replaced by something else. An awareness, perhaps, that their actions were on the edge of something indefensible. But pride held them together, pride and the belief that their authority shielded them from consequence. Marcus straightened his posture as much as he was allowed, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. He knew this night would not end here. He knew that truth hidden now would soon rise to the surface, and when it did, the very men who laughed at him would come to understand the cost of their assumptions. The humiliation had cut deep, but it had not broken him. Instead, it had planted the seed of what was to come, a revelation that would turn the balance of power upside down. For now, though, Marcus remained silent, standing beneath the harsh glow of prejudice. And though the night was heavy, he carried within him the unshakable knowledge that the story was far from over. The cold air wrapped itself around Marcus as the minutes dragged into hours, though time had lost its natural rhythm. What should have been a simple drive home had turned into a scene of suspicion and humiliation. He stood with his hands resting on the hood of his own car, listening to the shuffle of boots, the clicks of radios, the laughter that never carried warmth. But underneath the noise was a silence that Marcus knew well, the silence of injustice hanging unspoken in the night. And in that silence, something began to shift. The officers had searched everything they could touch. His documents, his wallet, his laptop bag, even the floor mats of his car had been turned over. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Yet still they lingered, unwilling to admit that their suspicion had been unfounded. It was as if letting Marcus go would mean surrendering the story they had already written in their minds. Pride kept them circling him like restless wolves. Pride and prejudice, an old pair of companions that had followed Marcus since childhood. The lead officer finally stepped back and pulled out his phone, his face lit by the faint glow of the screen. His voice was low but firm as he spoke into it, calling for something Marcus could not fully hear. Backup had already arrived, so this was different. Marcus suspected it was someone higher in the chain of command. A lieutenant, perhaps, maybe even a captain. Marcus's body was tired, but his mind was sharp. He had endured nights like this before, though none had stretched this long or carried this much weight. Still, he reminded himself of the words he had repeated all his life: dignity and silence, power and patience. He was not powerless, though the officers did not know that. He was not a man to be dismissed, though they had chosen to see him that way. The truth of who he was remained hidden, and soon, that truth would arrive with the force of revelation. The rumble of a car engine grew louder as another vehicle pulled up behind the flashing lights. Out stepped a man in a darker uniform, his rank visible in the way the younger officers immediately stiffened. The higher-ranking officer carried himself differently, with less arrogance and more authority. His eyes swept across the scene quickly, registering Marcus, the open car, the scattered documents on the ground, and the faces of the officers who had orchestrated it all. "What's going on here?" he asked firmly, his voice commanding without needing to shout. The lead officer straightened. "Routine stop, sir. Suspicious vehicle, suspicious driver. We were just checking things out." The superior officer's gaze narrowed slightly. He turned his attention to Marcus, and in that instant recognition dawned on his face. It was subtle at first, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw, but then it spread into certainty. He knew exactly who Marcus was. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone shifting into one of respect. "Sir, I didn't expect to see you here tonight." The younger officers froze. Their eyes darted between Marcus and their superior. Confusion etched into their faces. The smirks they had worn so confidently began to fade, replaced by unease. The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on the night harder than the flashing lights or the cold air. Marcus slowly lifted his head, meeting the superior officer's eyes with steady calm. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. He simply acknowledged the recognition with a quiet nod. The truth they had ignored, the truth they had mocked and dismissed, was standing before them now, undeniable. The superior officer turned to his men, his voice clipped. "Do you know who this is?" They shook their heads, their arrogance suddenly hollow. "This," he said firmly, pointing to Marcus with a gesture that carried weight, "is Mr. Marcus Carter. He is the head of internal affairs for this department." The words struck like a thunderclap. Internal affairs, the very branch of the department that held power over misconduct, that investigated abuses, that carried the authority to change careers, to end them, to rebuild them. And Marcus was not just part of it, he was the head of it. The man they had mocked, humiliated, and doubted was their superior, the very person who now held their fates in his hands. The color drained from the younger officers' faces. Their posture, once so stiff with arrogance, now faltered with fear. They glanced at each other, searching for words but finding none. The weight of what they had done pressed against them, heavier than any badge they wore. Marcus remained still. He let the silence hang, let the realization sink into their bones. He had no need to raise his voice or remind them of their behavior. The truth itself was louder than anything he could say. Finally he spoke, his words calm yet sharp enough to cut through the night. "Do you see now the danger of your assumptions?" His voice carried no anger, only truth, and that truth was more powerful than rage. It forced the officers to see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time. They had mocked his shoes, his suit, his documents, his voice. They had treated his dignity as if it were a costume he had borrowed. And now, that same man stood revealed as the one with the authority to hold them accountable. The superior officer cleared his throat, his eyes flashing with disapproval at his men. "Mr. Carter, I assure you this will be addressed immediately." Marcus nodded once more, his calm demeanor unshaken. But inside, he felt the weight of the turning point. This was not just about him. This was about every man and woman who had stood in his place, every time prejudice had gone unchecked. Tonight the veil had lifted and the lesson was clear. Authority without justice is hollow, and prejudice without truth is destined to fall apart. The younger officers tried to speak then, stumbling over apologies that rang empty in the cold night air. Their voices, once sharp and mocking, now carried hesitation and fear. But Marcus did not respond to their words. He did not need to. Their change in tone was not for him. It was for themselves, an attempt to undo what could not be undone. The turning point had arrived, and it was irreversible. Marcus knew it. They knew it. And the neighborhood watching from behind curtains knew it too. The man who had been humiliated moments earlier was now revealed as a symbol of something greater than himself. The truth that dignity and justice, though delayed, will always rise to the surface. The flashing light still bathed the street, but their meaning had changed. What once illuminated suspicion now cast light on truth. And in that light, Marcus stood not as a victim of humiliation, but as a reminder of accountability, as the embodiment of patience rewarded, as the proof that no assumption can hide the reality of who a person truly is. The turning point had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. The street had fallen into a deep, heavy silence after the superior officer revealed Marcus's true identity. The younger officers who had mocked him stood as if frozen, their arrogance stripped away and replaced with the uneasiness of men who suddenly realized their actions had consequences they had never considered. Their faces shifted between disbelief, regret, and fear, while their hands fidgeted nervously at their sides. Only moments ago they had been loud, mocking, filled with power that seemed unshakable. Now their silence was louder than their voices had ever been. Marcus straightened slowly, lifting his hands from the hood of the car. His body still carried the ache of humiliation, but his presence was calm, composed, and dignified. He did not rush to speak. He let the silence linger because silence now was no longer survival. It was power. It was the kind of silence that forced others to confront what they had done. Finally, Marcus turned his eyes toward the lead officer. "You searched my car without cause," he said softly, his words even but firm. "You mocked me without knowing me. You treated me as though I had no dignity, no identity, no worth. Tell me, what did you see when you looked at me tonight?" The lead officer swallowed hard, his voice catching in his throat. We thought you might be involved in something suspicious." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious? Or did you see only what you wanted to see?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The officer had no answer. His silence was an admission, louder than any confession could have been. The superior officer's jaw tightened. He shifted his glare between the men under his command and Marcus, as though trying to piece together how the situation had spiraled so far out of control. But he knew the answer already. It was written in the smirks that had vanished, in the careless laughter that now seemed shameful, in the broken image of men who had thought themselves untouchable. Marcus reached down to gather his papers from the ground. Slowly, he picked up the scattered pieces of his life, the documents that represented years of effort and responsibility. He placed them carefully back into his bag, restoring the order that had been so carelessly undone. The act was simple, but it carried weight. Each piece of paper returned to its place was a reminder that no amount of mockery could undo the truth of who he was. Once his things were back in order, Marcus looked again at the officers. "If I had been anyone else," he said, his tone steady but heavy, "this night would have ended very differently. If I did not hold this position, what would have become of me? What would have become of someone without the protection of a title or authority?" The words pierced through the air, leaving no room for excuses. The younger officers looked down, unable to meet his eyes. The reality of their behavior was now inescapable. They had not just failed in their duty, they had betrayed the very oath they had sworn to uphold. The superior officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I assure you this will be handled. These men will be held accountable." Marcus nodded, but his gaze remained locked on the younger officers. "Accountability is not enough if the lesson is not learned," he said. "You carry badges, but you forgot what they stand for. You forgot that every person you stop is more than your assumptions. You forgot that respect is not something you give only to those you recognize. It is something you owe to every human being." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, though never angry. It was the strength of truth, the kind that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The officers shifted uneasily, their faces pale under the glow of the flashing lights. They had wanted to see Marcus as small, but now he stood taller than all of them. Not because of his title, but because of the undeniable power of his dignity. Neighbors continued to watch from their windows, but the meaning of the scene had changed. Where once they had seen a man humiliated, now they saw a man revealed, a man who embodied quiet resilience and authority that needed no weapon or raised voice to be felt. Marcus was not only speaking to the officers, he was speaking to everyone who had ever been reduced by prejudice, to everyone who had been silenced by fear, to everyone who had endured humiliation in the hope that truth would one day come to light. The lead officer finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. I'm sorry," he muttered. The words sounded thin, insincere, but Marcus did not dismiss them. He simply nodded, not as forgiveness but as acknowledgement. "Do not be sorry to me," he said. "Be sorry to the people who never had the chance to reveal who they truly are before you made up your mind about them. Be sorry to the countless lives you may have scarred with your assumptions. Be sorry for forgetting what it means to serve." The apology ended there because nothing more could be said. Words could not undo what had been done. But the revelation of truth, the exposure of their prejudice, had already done its work. The officers would carry this night with them for the rest of their lives, a weight heavier than any badge. Marcus adjusted his suit jacket, his movements calm and deliberate. He was tired, but his spirit was unbroken. He looked at the superior officer one last time. "This is not just about me. This is about the culture you allow to exist. If this is how your men behave when no one is watching, then what trust can the public have in this department? Change must begin here, with you, with them, with all of us. Otherwise, this will happen again and again." The superior officer nodded slowly, the seriousness of Marcus's words settling over him. "You are right, Mr. Carter," he admitted quietly. "And I promise you this will not be ignored." Marcus gave a final nod, then turned to his car. He opened the driver's door, placed his bag on the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. For a moment, he simply sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. The weight of the night pressed against him, but alongside it came a sense of purpose. The humiliation had been real, the pain undeniable, but so too was the revelation. And with revelation came responsibility. The responsibility to use this moment not for revenge, but for change. As he started the engine, the flashing light still flickered in his rearview mirror. But their meaning had shifted. They no longer symbolized fear. They symbolized exposure, truth brought into the open, prejudice stripped bare for what it truly was. And as Marcus drove away, the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of men who had been confronted by truth and could no longer hide from it. The revelation had come, and its echo would last far longer than the flashing of red and blue lights. Marcus drove only a short distance before pulling his car over again, this time by choice. He switched off the engine, resting his hands on the steering wheel as the silence of the night pressed in around him. His heart beat steadily, but his mind replayed the events again and again, each moment sharper than the last, the flash of the lights in his rearview mirror, the cold metal of the hood under his palms, the mocking laughter of the officers, and finally, the stunned silence when the truth of his identity was revealed. The humiliation was still fresh, and though the officers' faces had shifted from arrogance to fear, the sting of their behavior lingered deep inside him. He stared out at the empty street. The houses were quiet now, curtains drawn tight, windows dark. The neighbors who had watched from behind glass had retreated into their homes, perhaps relieved that the spectacle had ended. But Marcus knew they would remember the image. A man in a suit, treated as if he were nothing, then suddenly revealed as someone who held more power than those who had mocked him. The neighbors would talk about it in whispers tomorrow. Some might feel shame for not stepping forward, others might justify their silence, and some might simply shrug, as though the night was just another ordinary event in a world where prejudice was anything but unusual. Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. He thought of his parents, of the lessons they had planted in him like seeds when he was a boy. His mother had taught him that patience was not weakness but strength, the strength to endure long enough for truth to reveal itself. His father had taught him that silence, when used wisely, could be louder than words, and both had taught him that dignity was the one thing no one could take from him, unless he gave it away. Those lessons had guided him tonight, just as they had guided him throughout his life. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath, Marcus realized something else. The lesson was not just for him. It was for them, the officers who had mocked him, the community that had watched in silence, the department that carried a culture of assumptions and prejudice. This was not a personal story, it was a mirror held up to an entire system, and the reflection it revealed was one that could no longer be ignored. He thought back to the moment when the superior officer had recognized him. The look on the younger officers' faces had been unforgettable. Fear, confusion, regret, all swirling together as the truth shattered the story they had created in their minds. Marcus had not needed to raise his voice or threaten them. The truth alone had been enough. It was a reminder that power does not come from cruelty or intimidation, but from integrity, patience, and the certainty of one's identity. As he sat in the stillness of his car, Marcus made a decision. He would not let this night pass quietly into memory. He would use it. Not for revenge, not for anger, but for change. The humiliation he endured could either remain a wound or become a weapon of transformation. And Marcus knew which choice he had to make. The next morning, he walked into the department building with his head held high. His colleagues greeted him with respect, but behind their greetings he sensed whispers, questions. News of the night before had already begun to spread. The officers involved were under review, their names spoken in hushed tones across hallways. Some people avoided Marcus's gaze, uncertain of what he would do next. Others looked at him with quiet admiration, recognizing the strength it must have taken to endure what he had endured. In a meeting with the police chief later that day, Marcus spoke clearly and without hesitation. He described the stop, the search, the humiliation, and the revelation. But he did not stop at his own experience. "This is not about me," he said firmly. "This is about every person who has stood where I stood, without the shield of a title to protect them. This is about a culture that allows assumptions to guide action instead of truth. And unless that changes, this department cannot earn the trust of the people it serves." The chief listened, his face grave. He promised investigations, discipline, reform. But Marcus knew promises were only the beginning. Change would not come from words alone. It would come from training, from accountability, from teaching officers to see every citizen as a human being first, not as a suspicion waiting to be proven. And so, Marcus began to work. He held workshops where he spoke about respect, dignity, and the dangers of assumptions. He invited community members to share their experiences, forcing officers to hear the voices they had too often ignored. He created policies that required justification for searches, documentation for stops, accountability for misconduct. It was not easy, change never was, but Marcus was relentless. He carried the memory of that night with him into every meeting, every policy draft, every difficult conversation. The officers who had mocked him were disciplined, their records marked permanently. Some left the force, unable to bear the shame of their exposure. Others stayed, changed by the experience, quieter and more careful in how they treated the people they encountered. Marcus did not relish their punishment. Instead, he hoped they carried the lesson forward. That authority without respect is hollow, and power without justice is nothing but cruelty in disguise. Beyond the department, Marcus's story began to spread. Newspapers wrote about it, community leaders spoke about it, and ordinary people found in his experience a reflection of their own struggles. He became more than a man who endured humiliation. He became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that truth has a way of rising no matter how deeply it is buried. People found hope in his calmness, strength in his dignity, and inspiration in his refusal to let anger consume him. But Marcus never forgot the human side of the lesson. He never allowed himself to see the officers only as villains. They were men shaped by a broken culture, by habits and assumptions passed down like shadows. To change the system, he knew he had to change hearts as well as policies. He had to teach them that the uniform they wore was not a shield for arrogance, but a responsibility to protect, serve, and respect every life they encountered. As weeks turned into months, Marcus noticed small shifts. Officers greeted citizens more respectfully. Stops became less frequent, and when they did occur, they were carried out with greater care. The community began to see the difference, slowly rebuilding trust. It was not perfect, and it would never erase the pain of nights like the one Marcus endured. But it was progress, and progress mattered. At night, when Marcus sat alone in his office, he often thought about that moment when the superior officer had spoken his name. It had been a turning point not only for the officers but for Marcus himself. It reminded him that identity is not given by others, it is carried within. No amount of prejudice can strip it away, and the lesson of that night was clear. Dignity is the most powerful weapon against injustice, because it cannot be mocked out of existence, cannot be searched out of a car, cannot be taken with laughter or humiliation. It endures. And Marcus carried that lesson not only for himself but for everyone who came after him. For the young men and women who would face flashing lights in their rearview mirrors, for the families who would pray for safe returns, for the countless lives that deserved respect, but too often received suspicion instead. His story was theirs, and theirs was his. The night of humiliation had become the seed of change, and the lesson it carried would grow far beyond one street, one department, one man. It would grow into a reminder that humanity, when held with dignity, is stronger than prejudice, stronger than arrogance, stronger than any flashing lights. The story of that night did not stay on the quiet street where it began. It rippled outward, carried on the voices of neighbors, whispered through the halls of the department, and later spoken in newsrooms and community centers. People told it again and again, each time with their own emphasis, but the heart of it never changed. A man who had been humiliated and dismissed stood tall, revealed as the one with power to change the very system that tried to reduce him. For Marcus, it was never about revenge. It was about truth, and truth, once revealed, could not be hidden again. In the days that followed, Marcus walked through the city with a different kind of presence. People who had only known his name now recognized his story. Strangers approached him to thank him, not because he had punished anyone, but because he had endured with dignity. "You gave us hope," one woman said as she shook his hand outside a grocery store. "You showed us that patience and truth are stronger than fear." Others simply nodded to him as he passed, their eyes carrying gratitude, respect, and sometimes even relief. It was as if his experience had spoken for all of them, had given shape to feelings they had carried in silence for years. But inspiration is not something Marcus sought for himself. He was not interested in being a hero, nor did he care for praise. What mattered to him was the work, the slow, difficult, often thankless work of reshaping a system that had grown comfortable in its flaws. He used every conversation, every meeting, every training session as an opportunity to plant seeds of change. And when he spoke, he did not use the language of anger. He used the language of humanity. He told officers about his childhood, about how his parents had raised him to value respect, about how he had studied harder than most because he knew the world would expect more of him. He described the fear of flashing lights in his rearview mirror, not because he had done wrong, but because he knew what assumptions could do. He explained that dignity was not a privilege granted by authority, but a right carried by every person, regardless of appearance or background. Some officers resisted, rolling their eyes at the lessons, but others listened, and slowly listening turned into understanding. The officers involved in the stop carried their own transformation. At first they were defensive, claiming they had only followed routine, but the weight of their mistake lingered. They were required to attend Marcus's sessions, to hear him speak not as a victim but as a leader. And though shame never leaves easily, it began to work on them. One of the younger officers approached Marcus quietly months later. His words were awkward, hesitant, but sincere. "I didn't see you that night," he admitted. "I saw only what I wanted to see. I've been thinking about it ever since. I don't want to be that man again." Marcus looked at him steadily and replied, "Then don't be. Every day you put on that uniform, you have the choice to see people as they are, not as your assumptions tell you. Make that choice again and again." It was not forgiveness, but it was guidance, and guidance was what they needed most. Beyond the department, Marcus's work inspired a wider conversation in the city. Community meetings grew larger, filled with people who wanted to share their own stories. Some spoke with anger, some with sadness, others with hope. Marcus listened to them all, because he believed listening was the first step to rebuilding trust. He became a bridge between the people and the department, standing in both worlds but never losing sight of his responsibility to truth. Children began to learn his name in schools. Teachers told the story as an example of dignity under pressure, of the importance of identity, of how assumptions can blind even those who wear badges of authority. Young people looked to Marcus not as a flawless figure, but as proof that resilience mattered. They saw in him the possibility that they too could rise above prejudice, that their own patience and strength could one day turn humiliation into inspiration. Marcus himself remained humble. He still walked the same streets, still drove the same car, still returned home at night to sit quietly in the living room where he could breathe away the weight of his responsibilities. He knew the work was far from over. Prejudice does not vanish overnight, and systems do not change with a single lesson. But he also knew that inspiration is not measured in grand victories. It is measured in small shifts, in an officer greeting a citizen with respect, in a child believing their worth is unshakable, in a community daring to trust again. He remembered the faces of the officers that night, their laughter, their doubt, their eventual fear, and he remembered the silence that came after his name was spoken. That silence, heavy and undeniable, was the moment when truth pierced through prejudice. It was the moment when the power they thought they held crumbled, replaced by the authority of dignity. Marcus carried that silence with him, not as a wound but as a reminder of what could be achieved when patience meets truth. Years later, people would still tell the story. It became more than a tale of one man and 3 officers. It became a parable about assumptions, about justice, about the strength of remaining calm in the face of mockery. It reminded people that true leadership is not measured by how loudly one commands, but by how quietly one endures and how powerfully one rises when the moment demands it. And in that way, Marcus Carter's name lived on, not as a title, not as a position, but as an inspiration. He was not remembered only as the head of internal affairs, but as the man who taught a city, a department, and a community that dignity is stronger than prejudice, that silence can carry power, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always come to light. The night that began with humiliation ended with transformation, and transformation carried forward became inspiration for countless others. Marcus knew that would be his legacy, not the fear of flashing lights, but the hope that they could one day shine on a world where respect was not earned through titles, but given freely to every human being.